In 1683, an army of roughly 150,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded the city of Vienna. For 2 months, the city starved behind its walls while Ottoman engineers dug tunnels beneath the fortifications, packing them with gunpowder, trying to blast their way into the heart of the Habsburg Empire. Food ran so low that residents were eating cats, dogs, and boiled leather. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Historians estimate that thousands of Viennese civilians and defenders died before relief ever arrived. Then, on September 12th, a combined force of Polish, Austrian, and German troops under King Jan III Sobieski smashed into the Ottoman lines from the hills above the city, and by nightfall, one of the largest sieges in European history was over. Vienna survived. The Ottoman advance into Central Europe, which had been building for over 150 years, was broken for good. And according to a story that has been told in bakeries for generations, the people of Vienna celebrated their survival with a pastry, shaped like a crescent moon, the symbol on the Ottoman flag, so that all of Vienna could bite into the enemy's emblem and swallow it whole. That pastry, so the story goes, would eventually become the croissant, a dish now eaten by the millions every single morning in Paris, sold in gas stations, folded into lunch boxes, and considered by nearly everyone on Earth to be quintessentially French. Here is the twist. It probably did not happen that way at all. So how did a pastry with a legend rooted in Austrian military triumph end up as the single most recognizable symbol of French baking, sold today for a couple of dollars in nearly every corner bakery on the planet? That story does not start in Paris. It starts almost 350 years ago, in Vienna, in a bakery that may or may not have existed, making a pastry that was already old news by the time the siege ever happened. To understand the crescent, you have to go back further than 1683. The pastry historians call the ancestor of the croissant is the Kipferl, a crescent-shaped bread or biscuit that appears in Austrian and Central European baking records long before the Ottomans ever laid siege to Vienna. Some food historians trace mentions of crescent-shaped baked goods in the region back to at least the 13th century, and possibly earlier. The Kipferl was not filled with butter, and it was not laminated the way a modern croissant is. It was often a denser bread, sometimes sweetened, sometimes plain, shaped into a curve for reasons that had nothing to do with any battle at all. Bakers in Central Europe had been twisting dough into crescents, circles, and braided shapes for centuries, mostly because those shapes baked evenly and looked distinctive on a shelf crowded with competitors. That is a far less dramatic explanation than swallowing the Ottoman flag, and it is almost certainly closer to the truth. Now, that siege story is almost certainly a myth, or at best a legend stretched to fit a shape that already existed. Some versions of the tale even move the timeline back further to an earlier Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529, which the city also survived. The problem is that no baking guild record, no city document, and no contemporary account from either 1529 or 1683 actually describes bakers inventing a crescent pastry to celebrate victory over the Turks. The earliest written versions of this legend do not appear until well over a century after the siege itself, showing up in 19th century French and Austrian texts long after the fact. Historians who study culinary folklore point out that almost every European country with a crescent-shaped baked good has its own version of this exact story, Budapest included, which suggests it is a legend that got attached to bread after the fact, not a factual account of how the bread came to be. But the story survives anyway, because it is a good story, and it explains the shape in a way that feels satisfying even when the paper trail says otherwise. The Kipferl, plain, humble, and not particularly buttery, kept being baked in Vienna for generations, regardless of which legend people preferred. It was a working-class staple, sold by street vendors and neighborhood bakeries, nothing like the luxury item the croissant would eventually become. Here is what actually made the Kipferl distinctive, and it has nothing to do with any army. Vienna, by the 17th and 18th centuries, had developed a genuine baking culture of its own, distinct from the bread traditions of France, Germany, or Italy. Viennese bakers were early adopters of using fresh brewer's yeast rather than older, slower sourdough starters, which gave their breads a lighter, airier texture than what most of Europe was used to at the time. This mattered enormously. A lighter, more delicate dough was easier to shape into decorative forms, crescents among them, and it baked faster and more evenly. The Kipferl was not a fluke invention born from a single dramatic event. It was the product of decades of quiet technical refinement by anonymous bakers whose names never made it into any history book at all. No dramatic siege, no queen, no legend, just patience, trial and error, and a guild of bakers slowly getting better at their jobs. By the 18th century, the Kipferl had also taken on a role beyond the bakery counter. It shows up in period accounts as a treat associated with the Habsburg imperial court in Vienna, sometimes served with coffee at breakfast, sometimes given as a small gift during holidays. Vienna, notably, also has its own contested legend about the introduction of coffee to the city, supposedly from sacks of coffee beans left behind by the retreating Ottoman army after the very same 1683 siege. Whether that story is any more accurate than the crescent legend is equally debated among historians, but the two legends fed off each other for centuries: coffee and crescent pastry, Vienna's dual culinary inheritance, both wrapped in stories about Ottoman defeat that are far more colorful than the historical record can actually support. This is where the story usually jumps straight to Marie Antoinette. And it is worth pausing here, because that leap is where a second myth gets bolted onto the first one. Marie Antoinette was born an Austrian archduchess in Vienna in 1755 and was sent to France in 1770 at the age of 14 to marry the future King Louis XVI, sealing an alliance between the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties. The popular version of the Croissant story claims that she brought her homesick craving for Viennese Kipferl with her to Versailles, and that French bakers, eager to please their new queen, began baking the crescent-shaped pastry for her, eventually evolving it into the croissant French people know today. It is a charming image, a homesick teenage queen introducing her adopted country to a pastry that would outlive the monarchy itself. But food historians who have dug through French bakery records, cookbooks, and guild documents from the late 18th century have found no evidence that any crescent-shaped pastry was being produced in Paris during Marie Antoinette's lifetime, let alone one associated with her specifically. She was executed in 1793. The earliest documented references to a croissant-like pastry actually being made and sold in France do not appear until decades after she was already dead. So if it was not the Ottomans, and it was not Marie Antoinette, who actually brought the crescent to France? The answer involves a bakery, a former artillery officer, and a business decision made in Paris in the late 1830s that had almost nothing to do with royal nostalgia and everything to do with opening a trendy new restaurant. That man's name was August Zang. Zang was an Austrian entrepreneur and by some accounts a former officer in the Austrian artillery who arrived in Paris around 1838 with an idea. He opened a bakery called the Boulangerie Viennoise, the Viennese bakery, on the Rue de Richelieu, and he began selling the breads and pastries of his home city to a Parisian public that had never really encountered them before. Among the items on offer were Vienna-style breads, distinctive for their lighter texture, and according to most food historians, some version of the Kipferl. Whether every detail of Zhang's biography and business is documented with total precision remains debated among culinary historians, since 19th century Parisian business records are far from complete. But the core fact is not in dispute. A Viennese-style bakery run by an Austrian opened in Paris in the late 1830s, and it introduced Parisians to an entire category of baked goods that the French had not previously made themselves. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything that comes after it. The Boulangerie Viennoise was wildly popular, and it was successful enough that it reportedly spawned imitators across the city within just a few years. Parisian bakers, seeing the demand for these Viennese-style breads, began adapting the Kipferl into their own techniques. And this is the part that does not get enough credit. French bakers already had 100 years of expertise in laminated dough, the technique of folding butter into layers of dough over and over to create flaky, airy pastry, used for things like puff pastry and vol au vents. Somewhere in the decades after Zang's bakery opened, French bakers appear to have applied that lamination technique to the Austrian crescent shape, and the result was something genuinely new. A pastry that was not quite the dense Austrian Kipferl and not quite traditional French puff pastry, but a hybrid of the two. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The croissant, the pastry the entire world associates with French identity, was not a French invention transplanted from Austria. It was a French reinvention of an Austrian import, built using French pastry science that the Austrians themselves had never applied to it. Here is the detail that makes this strange. The word croissant itself, simply French for crescent, does not show up attached to a specific pastry recipe in French cookbooks until surprisingly late. The earliest known printed recipe explicitly using the word croissant and describing something close to the modern laminated version appears in a French cookbook from 1905, written by a chef named Colombier. That means the croissant, as most people understand it today, layered, buttery, laminated, and instantly recognizable, is not some ancient French tradition stretching back centuries. It is a relatively modern invention, taking its final familiar form sometime in the late 19th or early 20th century, nearly 200 years after the siege of Vienna that supposedly inspired it, and roughly 60 to 70 years after Zang's bakery first introduced Parisians to the shape. Think about that for a second. Nearly 2 centuries passed between the legendary battle that supposedly created the crescent pastry and the actual written recipe for the thing people eat today. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, unpacking the real history behind everyday foods that everyone assumes they already understand. And you will not want to miss what comes next, because the croissant's next chapter involves world wars, industrial freezers, and a donut hybrid that once sold for more than 100 times its own weight in gold on the black market. By the early 20th century, the croissant had become a fixture of French bakeries. But it was still, for the most part, a handmade, labor-intensive product, made fresh each morning by bakers who woke before dawn to laminate dough by hand. Making a proper croissant requires folding butter into dough through a repeated process called turns, sometimes as many as 4 to 6 separate folds, each one requiring careful chilling in between so the butter does not melt into the dough and ruin the layering. Done correctly, this process creates as many as 50 to 80 distinct layers of butter and dough in a single croissant, which is exactly what produces that shattering, flaky exterior and that soft, honeycombed interior. Done incorrectly, you get a greasy, dense lump with none of the structure. This was not a fast process, and it was not a cheap one. It required skill that took years to develop, and for most of the early 20th century, that skill was concentrated almost entirely in professional French bakeries, which meant the croissant remained largely a French phenomenon, admired from a distance by the rest of the world, but rarely replicated well outside the country. Before any of that industrial transformation happened, though, it is worth pausing on the human cost baked into every handmade croissant sold in Paris during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because it was not a gentle profession. French bakers, known as boulangers, traditionally began their workday at 2 or 3 in the morning, in order to have fresh bread and pastry ready for customers by dawn. The ovens ran hot, often exceeding 200 degrees Celsius, in cramped basement kitchens with poor ventilation, and bakers frequently worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week, for wages that kept most of them firmly in the working class, despite producing a product increasingly associated with bourgeois café culture. This was not a footnote. French labor reformers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries specifically targeted bakery conditions, and it took until 1919 for France to legally establish an 8-hour workday across most industries, baking included, and even that law was resisted and unevenly enforced for years afterward. Night baking itself, the practice of working through the small hours of the morning so that bread could be ready at sunrise, was not banned outright in France until a law passed in 2015, and even that law applied only to certain categories of workers and left plenty of exceptions in place. Think about that for a second. The croissant most people picture as a symbol of leisurely Parisian mornings, coffee, a newspaper, a warm pastry, was for well over a century produced by people who never got to experience mornings that way themselves, because they were already 3 hours into their shift by the time the sun came up. That did not stop French bakers from treating croissant making as a genuine craft, almost a form of quiet artistry passed down through years of apprenticeship. Learning to properly laminate dough, controlling butter temperature down to a degree or two, timing the proofing of yeast against the humidity of a given morning, took most apprentice bakers years to master, and even experienced professionals could ruin an entire batch with one miscalculated fold. This is the part that does not get enough credit. Every croissant sold in a proper French bakery even today represents a skill set that took the industry roughly a century to fully develop, refine, and standardize. Starting from Zang's original Viennese import and ending somewhere around the codified recipe published in 1905. That began to change after World War II, as French culture, French cuisine, and French café culture became globally fashionable exports, tied up in a broader post-war fascination with French style and sophistication. Tourists who visited Paris came home talking about croissants the way earlier generations had talked about French wine or French fashion, and bakeries in other countries began attempting to recreate them, with mixed results. But the real transformation, the one that turned the croissant from a delicate French specialty into a mass-market product sold in nearly every grocery store on Earth, came from a completely different direction: the freezer. In the 1970s, French food scientists and industrial bakers developed methods for freezing raw laminated croissant dough before it was baked, allowing the delicate layered structure to survive the freezing process largely intact. This was not a small technical achievement. Freezing raw laminated dough risks destroying the very thing that makes a croissant, the crisp separation between dozens of paper-thin layers of butter and dough. Ice crystals can tear through that structure, and improper freezing had ruined countless earlier attempts. But French frozen dough companies working through the late 1970s and into the 1980s cracked the problem, and the implications were enormous. A bakery, a hotel, or eventually a gas station anywhere in the world could now stock frozen croissant dough, thaw it, proof it, and bake it fresh on-site without employing a single trained French pastry chef. This was not about seasoning food or preserving flavor. It was about erasing the need for decades of specialized human skill entirely, and replacing it with a freezer and a timer. That decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Frozen croissant dough is the single biggest reason the pastry went from a French cafe specialty to a global commodity. Major frozen food companies picked up the technology and ran with it. Companies across Europe and the United States began mass-producing frozen croissant dough for supermarkets and food service chains throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and the croissant, once a symbol of painstaking French craftsmanship, became something you could buy in a plastic tube at nearly any grocery store in America, pop open with a satisfying pop, and bake in your own oven in under 15 minutes. This is not something anyone in Vienna in 1683 or even Paris in 1905 could have imagined. A pastry built entirely on the premise of skilled, careful, hands-on labor had been reduced to an industrial product requiring almost none. Meanwhile, the traditional handmade croissant did not disappear. If anything, industrialization created a two-tier system that still exists today. Cheap, mass-produced frozen croissants sold by the millions in supermarkets and fast food chains, sitting right alongside artisanal hand-laminated croissants sold in high-end bakeries for several times the price, made using essentially the same multi-day, multi-fold process French bakers were using more than a century earlier. Both versions are called croissants. Both trace back to that same Austrian Kipferl and that same French lamination technique. But one takes 15 minutes in a freezer, and the other takes a trained baker roughly 3 days of careful temperature-controlled work. Today, France alone produces and sells well over 1 billion croissants every single year. And croissants and related viennoiserie products, the broader French category of Vienna-style breakfast pastries that also includes pain au chocolat and pain au raisin, represent billions of dollars in sales annually across French bakeries alone. Global estimates for the broader bakery and pastry market run into the hundreds of billions of dollars, with croissants standing as one of the most recognizable and widely exported single items in that entire category. Roughly 80% of French households report eating croissants regularly, and the pastry has become such an ingrained part of French breakfast culture that the government has, at various points, weighed in on regulations concerning what can legally be labeled a pur beurre or pure butter croissant, as opposed to one made with cheaper margarine or vegetable oil substitutes. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A pur beurre croissant, made entirely with real butter, tends to curve into that classic crescent shape because of how butter behaves differently from margarine during baking. A straight croissant, one without much curve, is often a signal that it was made with margarine instead. Which is why, in a strange twist, the truly authentic French croissant is often the straighter one, not the curved one, even though the curve is the entire reason the pastry became famous as a crescent in the first place. But croissants are far more than just a breakfast item at this point, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. In May of 2013, a pastry chef in New York City named Dominique Ansel unveiled a pastry he called the Cronut, a croissant donut hybrid, laminated like a croissant but shaped and fried like a donut, then filled and glazed. The demand was, by any reasonable standard, absurd. Lines began forming outside Ansel's bakery in Soho before dawn, with customers waiting for hours for a chance to buy one, and the bakery limited sales to 2 per customer specifically to prevent hoarding. It did not matter. A black market for cronuts sprang up almost immediately, with resellers reportedly charging as much as $40 to $100 for pastries that sold for around $5 at the counter. A markup of nearly 2,000% for what was, at the end of the day, a piece of fried, sugared dough. Ansel trademarked the name Cronut specifically to prevent other bakeries from copying it directly, but that did not stop a wave of croissant hybrid pastries from spreading across the world under different names, from the Duffin in London to countless local imitators everywhere from Seoul to Sydney. Think about that for a second. A pastry with roots in a possibly mythical Austrian legend from 1683 spawned a genuine media frenzy and a black market resale economy in Manhattan in 2013, over 330 years later. The croissant's global spread has also produced some genuinely strange regional variations. The kind of thing that would have baffled both the Viennese bakers who made the original Kipferl and the Parisian bakers who laminated it into its modern form. In Japan, convenience store chains sell croissants filled with everything from matcha custard to curry, and Japanese bakeries have become so respected for their pastry technique that some Japanese-trained pastry chefs now teach lamination technique back to bakers in France. In the United States, the almond croissant, made from a day-old croissant soaked in almond syrup, filled with almond cream and topped with sliced almonds and powdered sugar, has become popular enough to be considered a separate bakery category of its own, a way of using up unsold pastry that turned into a specialty in its own right. In South Korea, croissant sandwiches stuffed with everything from bulgogi to egg salad have become a fixture of urban cafe culture. None of these variations existed anywhere near Vienna in 1683 or Paris in 1905. They're the product of a pastry that, once it left France, kept absorbing whatever local food culture it landed in, the same way it absorbed French lamination technique after leaving Austria in the first place. Meanwhile, back in France, the government has continued treating the croissant as something worth legally protecting. Beyond the per beurre labeling rules, some French towns and regions hold informal and occasionally formal competitions for the best local croissant, judged on criteria like the evenness of the lamination, the color of the crust, and the honeycomb structure of the crumb when the pastry is torn open. Bakers who win these competitions can see a meaningful boost in business, and being crowned the best boulanger in a Parisian arrondissement, one of the city's administrative districts, carries genuine prestige, occasionally even earning a baker the right to supply croissants to the French president's own household for the following year. A pastry shaped like a symbol of a 17th century military defeat now doubles in modern France as a kind of civic honor. Here is the uncomfortable reality that most people never think about when they bite into a croissant. Nearly everything about its popular origin story is at best only loosely connected to the historical record. The Siege of Vienna almost certainly did not produce the pastry directly. Marie Antoinette almost certainly did not personally introduce it to France. The version most people eat today was not fully codified in writing until 1905, and the thing that actually made it a global phenomenon was not a queen or a battle or even a particularly brilliant baker, but an industrial freezer developed in the 1970s that let bakeries skip the hardest part of making one. And yet the legend persists anyway, printed on menus, repeated by tour guides in Paris, and told in coffee shops from Tokyo to Toronto. Because it is simply a better story than the truth. An Austrian immigrant opening a bakery on a random street in Paris in 1838 and quietly changing global breakfast forever. So think about the whole arc of it. It was there, or at least its ancestor was, in the bakeries of Vienna centuries before anyone ever fought over a crescent moon. It was there, reinvented from scratch, in a Parisian bakery run by an Austrian entrepreneur in the 1830s. It was there, finally written down and formalized in a French cookbook in 1905. It was there, frozen solid and shipped by the truckload in the industrial food revolution of the 1970s and 80s. It was there, causing a genuine stampede and a black market resale scheme on a sidewalk in Soho in 2013. And it is there, right now, sitting in a paper bag on your kitchen counter, or in a plastic tray at the grocery store, costing you somewhere between $2 and $5, whether it took 3 days of skilled hand lamination to make, or 15 minutes out of a freezer. Not bad, honestly, for a pastry whose most famous origin story is probably not even true. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which detail caught you off guard. The Marie Antoinette myth, the Austrian bakery in Paris, or the fact that the authentic croissant is actually the straight one instead of the curved one. If you enjoyed this, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have a lot more stories like this one coming, tracing the real, tangled, and often surprising histories hiding behind the food sitting in your kitchen right now. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.